Welcome, everyone, to this episode of You Don't Have to Yell, the podcast and occasional webcast focused on third-party we'll edit that part out, third-party advocacy and electoral reform. I am joined today by Walter Olson. This is really a disaster. I am joined today by Walter Olson, senior fellow at the Cato Institute, who is far more well-spoken than I am. Thank you for joining me, Walter.
Thank you, Dan.
Good. Given my opening here, I'm hoping you can carry the day. So before we get started, Walter and I were talking about our Zoom backgrounds and the general level of aesthetic fakery that has gone on since the pandemic. And Walter made me aware of one of the most interesting statistics, which I'll ask you to confirm for me, which is that clothing sales on the whole have been down. However, everything from the waist up has done fantastic. Is that correct?
Roughly, yeah. That's what I've read, at least in the business press. And of course, the pandemic was terrible for apparel sales. But the silver lining was that people were still buying business wear from the waist up.
I think that is absolutely fantastic. Yeah. And for those wondering, I am indeed wearing a genuine pair of pants today, but only because I have my niece's birthday party to go to later on this afternoon. Otherwise, I would be very much in my work pajamas. So Walter, the reason I was so eager to speak with you is obviously the work you've done and the work you're doing with redistricting in Maryland. And one of the things we've been talking about on this podcast recently is gerrymandering and kind of the role that plays in the tone of politics today. And I want to get to that a little later on. But to kick things off, in reading I've done in the past, Maryland always comes up as one of the states that is more heavily gerrymandered in the union. And I heard one guy refer to one district in Maryland, I believe, as a tentacled horror was the word he used. So how well earned is that reputation, would you say?
As far as U.S. House of Representatives seats, Maryland has really the worst gerrymander in the country. And for years, it was kind of a neck and neck race between Maryland and North Carolina, which had the worst. And then a couple of court decisions struck down the North Carolina maps, leaving Maryland kind of undisputed as king of the hill for having the worst House districts. And the description you heard is probably one of the descriptions of the 3rd district, probably the worst district in the country, which has been compared by a federal judge and others to a broken-winged pterodactyl, to a praying mantis. And my favorite of these is to the blood spatters at a crime scene.
Okay. Broken wing pterodactyl. That actually, up until then, the most creative district named I heard was Donald Kicking Goofy.
That was a great name. And once you see the image, you can never forget it in that district. But I have Maryland pride. That was a Pennsylvania district. And to get back to our 3rd congressional district, a reform group did a so-called gerrymander meander, which was an event intended to call attention to how bad it was by trying to go from one end of the 3rd district to another without entering any other district. And multiple forms of conveyance were needed because cars would not do it. At one point, you had to get into a boat and row or otherwise get from one part of the Chesapeake Bay to another, because it had only, this is what we redistricting nerds call water contiguity. It is one contiguous district, but only if you go across water.
So that exists.
Yes. Now, of course, you need water contiguity if you're islands like Hawaii, but Maryland doesn't really need that. It was just a completely artificial mechanism for linking 2 areas that they wanted to.
Oh my. Yeah. Don't let the folks in Massachusetts figure that one out, because we could go nuts with that one. Now, you were part of the Maryland Redistricting Commission back in 2015. And what was that experience like?
Well, we've actually had 3 redistricting commissions under Laurie Hogan. So let me
Okay.
start with the beginning, because each of the three was different.
Okay.
Hogan was elected in 2014 with the Maryland gerrymander as one of his big issues. He really campaigned on it. And one politically understandable reason for that is that it's a more or less unanimous subject for everyone who was not part of the gerrymander, 70% or so, including really the same support among Democrats, Republicans, and
Okay.
independents. Get rid of the gerrymander, widespread outrage at it. So he campaigned on that. And when he got in, first year he was in office, he acted on those promises by appointing the Maryland Redistricting Reform Commission, which, like the subsequent two ones, I've had the honor of being co-chair of. There, in each case, there's been a Democratic co-chair, and for the last two, there's also been an independent co-chair. But the point of that first one, which was something of a blue ribbon commission with people from many well-known groups like the League of Women Voters and Common Cause, NAACP. But the point of that one was to not to draw any lines, but to propose what a better system would be. What should a citizens commission look like? And of course, citizens commissions have come in a bunch of states, mostly Western states, as a change up from the old practice of letting the legislators themselves decide, letting the state legislature decide, which is how historically it's been done. So Governor Hogan gave us that commission. What would the best possible system look like, bearing in mind both the special conditions of Maryland, which is a geographically small state that is very used to face-to-face politics. Unlike California, Maryland is really used to people having met their representatives. It's a small enough state that can happen. And also trying to learn from the good and the bad of citizen commissions in states like Arizona and California. And California, a huge state, almost has to do things differently, but it also has money to burn to make certain types of things work. And Arizona, which was out there early with the format, ran into some trouble, lots of litigation. They had the practice of having one person, one independent in the middle as the tiebreaker. And we tried to learn a lesson from that, which is that there were attempts to fire that person, there were attempts to sue that person into miserable submission. And so one of the lessons we picked up early is don't have just one tiebreaker, have maybe three independents so that it's not as easy a target to shoot at.
Okay. Yeah.
So we were trying to learn from that early experience of the states that had gone first with independent commissions, pick up on the best practices, make sure it was suitable for our size state and our particular political history. And so that was that commission turned things around and reported back less than 6 months later. We had a chance to use those recommendations about 3 years later with what was called the Emergency 6th District Commission. And that happened because our ridiculous congressional districts were the subject of litigation. And although some of the litigation washed out over the years, and eventually it went up to the Supreme Court 3 times, and eventually, not to get ahead of the story, but they ruled that there was no federal right to sue over partisan gerrymandering. But before they came out with that final verdict, the federal courts looked at the 6th district, one of our bad districts, and struck it down and said, this is unconstitutionally partisan. And so at that point, you had a court ruling that the 6th district was illegal. You didn't yet have a replacement order for what the 6th district should look like. So Governor Hogan saw that as a great opportunity. He got appointed the chairs of what we then went on and filled out as a citizen commission to say what the 6th district should look like, with the idea being present the court with a remedy that had been not only drawn fairly as opposed to unfairly, but it had also been put through public hearings. The people had it from the affected parts of Western Maryland would have a chance to comment on it. And one of my favorite parts of the process, not only was there sunshine throughout with our meetings being streamed and lots of different portals for public comment of different sorts, but also a portal for public map submission. And
Mhm.
this is part of what I love about the redistricting reform game, is that even though big data and computer prowess is used by the bad guys to come up with incredibly fine-tuned gerrymandering, the public can strike back with public availability of data, cheap or free software programs that you can run from your phone or your desktop, and effectively counter-programming, where anyone who wants to get one of these programs can submit counter maps, submit fair ones to to provide a clear alternative to the bad, unfair ones. And we, in fact, adopted a publicly submitted map for our 6th district project.
Interesting.
If you don't mind my rambling on through one more story about public map submission,
Yeah, please.
the story that I most love to tell from this field, Pennsylvania is a state that is mostly stuck with pretty bad gerrymandering
Yeah.
practices. But for whatever reason, it also had enough public data availability that it was possible for the public to submit maps. And so when it wound up in court, going to the Pennsylvania Supreme Court, which has more than once seen gerrymandering cases, which it's decided under its own state law and state constitution, the state house districts, the not U.S. House, but the ones for the Pennsylvania state legislature, were done very, very badly or unfairly,
Hmm.
favoring the incumbent party, the Republicans. So a piano teacher from Allentown submitted a map, and the Pennsylvania Supreme Court ruled that it wasn't going to order her map into law, but her map was so clearly fairer than the one the legislature had done that it felt emboldened to strike down the legislature's map and tell them to go back and do it again. So this is kind of the promise and the fun of public map submission, is that it is a really level playing field for everyone who is nerdy enough to want to try this thing in the first place. A court might find their map to be better.
Yeah. So that's super interesting. So how do you get agreement on the submitted map? Because obviously, in any redistricting commission, there are incentive structures to tilt the map as much in your favor as possible, or as much in the favor of your party. How do you reach? How did they figure out or come to an agreement on which publicly submitted map to use?
Let me take a big step back and
Yeah.
talk about um, the different inputs, and I put them in 3 kind of categories. Who
Hmm.
gets to decide
Okay.
what map to propose?
Hmm.
What are the ground rules as far as what's the specifications of a good district versus a bad district? And finally, what procedural rules do they have to follow in getting there? And so briefly starting out, first one we've already talked a bit about, which is who gets to decide. And you've got the old format where the state legislature, sometimes with input from the governor, decides super self-interested or conflict of interested,
Hmm.
depending on how you want to look at it. But there are a bunch of other different formats, and you can go all the way to the opposite end of a citizens commission. We like to uh, boast of the fact that, unlike some of the um, uh, reform ideas that have come in through state initiatives in states like California and Arizona, there was no legislative veto. There was no um, chance for people with an obvious interest in the outcome to exercise like peremptory challenges. You've got those in several states of they're being able to kick people off the commission that they think that they don't want to take their chances with.
Hmm.
So we had one where it was much more genuinely a citizen commission, but there are lots of other formats too. Some states bring in judges or retired judges. Some states have politicians on it, but they insist that it be balanced, and maybe they'll use the chief justice as a tiebreaker. We can get into some of the other methods, but getting back to what Maryland did, it insisted on no legislative input really at all, and
Hmm.
no input from anyone who's going to run, no lobbyists, um, no one who had worked too recently for any of these legislative bodies and so forth. A whole bunch of things intended to um, uh, keep it for citizens, and also the very important partisan specification. And everyone finds they have to do some version of this, which is no majority from a single, registered with a single political party. And indeed, following the problems that Arizona had, we did a 3-3-3 system.
Hmm.
3 registered Democrats, 3 registered Republicans, 3 who had not been registered, either of those, and had not changed registration. Who could in principle be a registered Green or Libertarian. In practice,
Yeah.
so far it's been just registered independents.
I want to I want to highlight that for everyone watching and for everyone listening, because it sounds to me like one of the biggest things, or one of the more important things that you can do when looking to create fair and effective redistricting would be to, number one, have a commission whose role is ironclad, so is not necessarily is not subject to the whims of the legislature, interested parties, number one. And of course, this idea of balance between the parties, but I think more importantly, balance with independents as well, so they're equally what's the word I should say, so each has an equal say in the vote. Did I hear that correctly?
You did, and one more rule that I didn't mention, but that can be important, is
Yeah.
to get a recommendation for a map. Many states, including ours, specify a supermajority. That is not just 5 of the 9, but 6 or 7 of the 9. And if you go up to a strong 7 of the 9, then you're really saying that at least one person from each of the party configurations needs to give their approval. So that reduces the chance that something that's terribly unfair to Democrats,
Mhm.
or for that matter, something where the Democrats and Republicans carve things up. I call that a buddy mander, where you really do see maps where the 2 major parties have gotten together and carved things up so that everything is safe for one party or the other. But the independents also, would have a reason to object if they've sense that this is going on, that
Yeah.
partisanship is coming back in. So that rule of a supermajority needed to approve a map has been found to be pretty wise. I think it is the rule in a lot of different states, and we also adopted that. So there's first that question of who decides.
Yeah.
Um, uh, and we can talk more about that if you like, but otherwise I'll go on to category
Yeah.
2. Category 2 is what is specified, and there needs to be some specification for what's good districting. And in Maryland, we've got if you want to look at it this way, a very plain and vanilla set of criteria. Compactness, which
Mhm.
means the district should be more like squares or circles and less like snakes or praying mantises.
Mhm.
Um, and call us traumatized by the experience of the last couple of maps if you want, but
Yeah.
that was front and center with the governor's order. Compactness is to be a major um, uh, uh, filter of what gets through. And secondly, um, uh, the respect for the boundaries of smaller political subdivisions, counties and municipalities. Now, here's one where it's a little bit harder to speak universally. Compactness, I think, is good everywhere. Respect for county boundaries makes a huge amount of sense in Maryland, where counties are very, very powerful and deliver most government services that are not delivered by the state.
Mhm.
Counties are not important in New England as much, for
Mhm.
example, where the government services tend to be delivered by the municipalities, the towns and cities. So you wouldn't necessarily have exactly the same rule in New England as you would in Maryland, but in our state, where county politics is super important. A lot of the population in major counties like Baltimore County and Howard County, there are no municipalities. Everything is county services. So respecting the county boundaries and also municipal boundaries was another big part of our plan. And the And we did not specify some things that do crop up in many other states. For example, one state, Arizona, and as far as I know, it's the only one, instructs its commission to try to maximize the number of swing or um, uh, potentially on districts where you don't know who's going to win, districts where the
Hmm.
registration of the parties or the voting patterns in the past have been close enough to suggest that both parties could put up a real contest. And I'll get in a minute to why we not only didn't put that in, but we kind of went off in the opposite direction, because a
Yeah.
lot of people like the idea of competitive districts.
Hmm.
And another thing that is done in one or two places, I believe that Ohio has recommended this for its state house districts, is uh, to mimic the results of proportional representation. And again, you have a lot of people who strongly believe that if a state is 55% Democrat and 45% Republican, then a good map is one where the seats also come out that way.
Hmm.
Again, I can see the logic, but it's not the way that Maryland went. And what we did instead is the way that California and Iowa, to name two states, there may be others, have gone off, which is so-called blinding. And
Hmm.
in Maryland, the marching orders of the commission are um, do not look at or consider in your deliberations um, the political coloration of any communities. Don't look at voting registration, Republican versus Democrat versus anything
Hmm.
else. Don't look at past voting history because it will tell you which party tends to win. And don't even look, and this is one of my favorite rules, I have to confess, don't look at the place of residence of any individual, such as an incumbent. So that keeps us from making sure that anyone lives in a district that will be good for them. We have to ignore where they live, and challengers and everyone else, of course, too. Now, you notice that this is not just different from, but it's inconsistent with those potential decision mechanisms of make districts competitive or make districts proportionally representational. We can't do that because we're not allowed to look at the data that would let us do that.
Yeah, and there are two things that were left out that I want your opinion on, and something I've heard in past episodes as well, which is, two of the aspects that sometimes challenge the idea of compactness and even contiguity, for that matter, or semblance of contiguity. Um, is, number one, the concept of communities of interest. So, for example, keeping a rural block together rather than splitting them in two and potentially diluting their voting power. The second would be preserving the minority vote, or the power of the minority vote as well. And we saw this in North Carolina, where I think it was actually the Republican Party that challenged the redistricting map on the grounds of it violating the Voting Rights Act, because it diluted, in their opinion, the vote of the African American vote there. What are your comments on that, on those two
Well, those
aspects?
are two very different questions, because the Voting Rights Act means that there's a whole lot of law that has to be followed in the case of minority communities of interest.
Hmm.
And without the Voting Rights Act, there is no such legal framework on questions like keep farming communities together.
Hmm.
And so let me take the first one first, which is communities of interest. Uh, I am suspicious of the phrase communities of interest because
Hmm.
I've seen it be invoked for so many different reasons. Um, and you find, as you get into um, the subject, that people can present almost any desired map as a combination of communities of interest. We have a notorious example from Maryland where they came up with their intended six-district gerrymander, um, and someone said, wait a minute, we need some way to defend this to the public, don't we? And so they thought and thought, and they said, oh, well, we'll call this the Interstate 270 commute district, because it includes It happens to include Interstate 270 all the way out to
Uh-huh.
from the farthest western part of the state.
Yeah.
If those people ever want to go into Washington, D.C., they have to drive through all the rest of the district. So we're going to call it that. And the Supreme Court actually laughed at this when it wound up being part of the oral argument, because it was so obviously a back formation, as they might say in linguistics. It was cobbled together to excuse something that they wanted to do for other reasons, and even they didn't quite believe it. And you find similarly, for keeping farming districts together was a helpful excuse for a gerrymander in one instance, because those districts all voted Republican and they wanted to pack the Republicans. In another instance, it wasn't convenient for their wish to break up farming districts, none of which would have their own representative. And so they went in completely the opposite direction
Mm,
and ignored the case for keeping farming districts together.
mm,
Same crowd, same year, but again, what emerged as communities of interest was purely tactical. And
mhm,
so I acknowledge that there is something to it, in that um, there really are communities that feel that they are historically and practically and in other ways together with others communities, even if it sprawls across a county line or a municipal line. They will tell people, oh, welcome to such and suchville, and it will happen to sprawl across a line. And I believe that it's okay and desirable to respect that. When people
yeah.
talk about a community that they feel they live in, it's good to listen to that part of it. And um, so I think the testimony that our commissions have heard and will hear welcome people talking about, and just as good districting takes into account things like mountain ranges. Do you live east or west of
Mhm.
the mountain range, which sometimes means that you depart from compactness, because if you apply compactness to a map in a place like Oregon, you find sometimes that you are forcing a couple of east of the Rockies communities to
Mm,
um, together with people that they are not anything other than as the crow flies
yeah.
compact with. And so
Yeah.
you need some recognition that genuine connection by being able to drive someplace. This also happens in Maryland with the Chesapeake Bay, because you apply a mechanical um, algorithm of compactness, and
Mhm.
before long, you've put some people on the west side of the Chesapeake Bay. You force them into a district with the Eastern Shore, whether or not there's any easy way for them to get there. So, yeah. Anyway, I'm getting back to communities of interest. Yes, they have a role, but I just don't want it to be a blank check.
Yeah, that makes sense. And also, it seems to me like with the standards that you have set up, like so compactness, having a balanced commission, and having there be a requirement that they come in blind to at least very detailed data on the districts they're carving. It sounds like there's then room to open up a conversation about why an exception might be made for a community of interest without it just being an excuse or a way to reverse engineer a reason
It,
for some disaster of a district to be carved,
and I
correct?
like to think that it will emerge in the public hearing record.
Yeah.
Certainly, some counties feel some fellow feeling with others. They're part of um, historically recognized sections of the state, and
Mhm.
they see a logic in combining counties that have had that kind
Mhm.
of kinship. But um, let me move over to the other set of issues regarding race and redistricting, because
Yeah.
there you have the Federal Voting Rights Act and the constitutional provisions on which it's based to implement. And so it's no longer a matter of the states choosing from any of the different possibilities. Some of the possibilities are required and others are forbidden by the Voting Rights Act. Um, However, that still leaves a lot that is uh, both discretionary and sometimes that legally simply has not been settled yet. And
Mhm.
I'll offer one example. Most Voting Rights Act litigation has um, involved a single discrete identifiable minority, African Americans, or in some cases Hispanics.
Hmm.
Maryland, as one of the most ethnically varied states in the United States, we have some of the most polyglot um, communities other than Queens, New York. I think a couple of the other top five um, uh, uh, communities as far as having multiple language um, origins and things like that are in the state of Maryland. And so that raises front and center the question of, does the Voting Rights Act have anything to say for or against for so-called majority minority districts where no single minority group is necessarily politically going to be calling the tune? It's easy to construct in Maryland districts in which between white Anglos, African Americans, Hispanics, and Asian Americans, you have something like 1/4 of each, because Maryland has strong ethnic concentrations of that sort. So it will be interesting to consider, and there is, so far as I can tell, and again, I'm not going to be able to jump the gun on issues that we have to decide as a commission and with all of us weighing in. But so far as I know, there is no orthodoxy about how that should be approached. We will listen. We will see who people feel is one community over that they see the logic. To what extent is jumping a county boundary going to make sense, and to what extent not?
Okay. Okay. Now, one of the things that the conversation around gerrymandering often centers on is, or I should say, the thing the conversation around gerrymandering typically centers on are federal districts. One of the things I've learned, again, as I've explored, is that it's equally important at the state level as well, because very often, again, depending on which state you live in, that legislature may be responsible for carving the federal districts. So it kind of feeds up. Is your commission also looking at the state level, at the General Assembly in Maryland, or is that the purview of some
We
other
are
power?
charged with drawing maps for both U.S. House and for the Maryland upper and lower houses in
Okay.
Annapolis. And it is indeed um, tremendously important. Um, uh, the two are on slightly different tracks in Maryland as in many states. As you can imagine, the legislature takes extra special care of the rules for its own districts in some
Mm-hmm.
ways, and yet um, the Maryland Constitution gives them slightly different treatment, and actually gives the courts a little more role of being able to supervise the drawing of the electoral districts.
Mm-hmm.
And for that reason, the gerrymandering practices, although there has certainly been some bad gerrymandering of state house districts, it hasn't been quite as outrageous because of that fear of courts stepping in and
Sure.
correcting things. Basically, the Maryland Constitution provides no grounds whatsoever for courts to strike down the U.S. House districts
Mm-hmm.
as overly gerrymandered. So they basically can, it's a world of sheer imagination, as some cartoon company once put it.
Yeah.
They can really do anything practically with the U.S. House districts. They have to be a little more careful, and they are a little more careful with the State House.
Okay, understood. I want to pivot a little bit, because one of the things I found really interesting as I was reading up on your work and your bio as well, is that your partisan journey, if you want to call it that, is very similar to mine. And I bring this up every now and then on this show, where I was born and raised a Republican, or a Massachusetts Republican, which now is probably functionally a Democrat in some circles. Um, but I was born and raised with a conservative upbringing, or conservative at the time, and my deviation from the party came during the Bush administration, and it came for many of the same reasons. Uh, that well, I don't want to steal your thunder here, but it really seemed to mimic a lot of the things you were thinking too. And I want to bring this up where I promise everyone we're going to get back to gerrymandering. This leads back there. But I'd just like you to describe that, because you actually started out campaigning for George W. Bush in 2000, correct?
I did, and it is a long story, like so many people's political
Yeah.
stories. I've always been identified as small L libertarian,
Okay.
as is the Cato Institute,
Yeah.
the and that means that Republican candidates are never going to be entirely satisfactory. But depending on
Mhm.
what their issues are, depending on what their approach to the use of government force is,
Mhm.
they may be pretty good, or they may, uh, while my uh, uh, sense of something being wrong. And the with George W. Bush, uh, I was deeply involved with a career with a topic that I spent much of my career on, which is problems of excessive litigation and
Mhm.
the um, reining in excessive litigation. Now, it happened that George W. Bush was the president who took an interest in this topic
Okay.
beyond any other, along with Vice
Mhm.
President Dan Quayle, really made it his own kind of crusade, which meant that as someone who had written several books in that area, I was thrilled and honored that he wanted to draw on my work. I flew out to Austin, was happy to give them, my best advice about what the proper role for the federal government is, because of course a lot of this stuff is not appropriately addressed at the federal level, but rather at the state level.
Yeah.
But give them my most honest advice, and it was thrilling to see that they would sometimes nod to themes that I had laid out as the right ones. But of course, a president's time in office is not just about your favorite issue. People need to
Yeah.
learn that hearing very welcome things about your favorite issue is not the be all and end all of what presidents should be. And at the
Mhm.
same time, um, you know, he was being talked into, and I don't know whether this is the real him or not, but he was
Yeah.
being talked into um, campaigning that I thought was very demagogic
Mhm.
against the aspirations of gay people, for example, where
Mhm.
he locked himself into some positions that I found very, very objectionable. Republicans in general were not covering themselves in glory in those days on those issues.
Yeah.
I hope that we can look back and say they got over some of those things, but at the time they were misbehaving pretty badly, and George W. Bush was encouraging them to misbehave. So I just sort of checked out and said, I've had the chance, which I value greatly, to be
Mhm.
listened to carefully on issues that I think are, um, part of what I have to contribute to the world. But I don't have to vote for every Republican um, who comes along, and I can hold out for ones that I like better, or vote third party. And this, some of these same things came up with a very different um, configuration of issues when the Republicans decided to nominate Donald Trump, someone I
Mhm.
find completely unacceptable and would never vote for.
Yeah.
There is the Libertarian Party. I love them dearly. I don't always vote for the Libertarians just because I'm a small L Libertarian. But
Mhm.
when they've got Gary Johnson, someone who actually was quite a decent governor of New Mexico for 2 terms, and Bill Weld from Massachusetts, who I also, find very congenial.
Mhm.
I really like Bill Weld. Um, so I figured, look, if you're going to be serious, I'm going to go ahead and vote for you. And,
Yeah.
and I went and did.
Yeah, so it's funny. I volunteered for Bill Weld's Senate campaign against then Senator John Kerry back in 96. I was a huge fan of Bill Weld. And for those of you who only know him through his primary challenge to Trump, and prior to that, his running under the Libertarian ticket as vice president. Bill Weld was what I would consider your classic Northeast Republican or your classic Northeast conservative, which was fiscally conservative, but very liberal on social issues. And the reason I bring this up is because over the last 2 decades, there has been an extinction of, or there's been a great diminishment of what I'll call, the Bill Weld Republicans out there. And so, for example, you have Charlie Baker, the governor here in Massachusetts. I think you could consider Larry Hogan, governor of
Very much
Maryland.
so.
Yeah, you could go on.
Uh,
Sorry.
Charlie Baker and Larry Hogan have a great deal in common, and I watch with interest as Baker simultaneously is extraordinarily popular in the polls generally in Massachusetts,
Yeah.
but struggles to get renominated by his own Massachusetts Republican Party, which has veered so far that it's not clear that this super popular governor, next time, I mean, he managed to get it for re-election, but, were time to go on, who knows whether he could even hold the nomination of the splinter of the Massachusetts Republican Party that is left.
Yeah, I can speak freely because I am not affiliated with the Massachusetts Republican Party. They cannot get out of their own way. And if you are truly the free market party, right? The market's telling you what they want. You have a state that is overwhelmingly Democratic voting for a Republican governor. You can't get better. But part of the reason I ask you this is because, again, we're maybe not talking Maryland, but talking general. One of the things I've learned, and one of the things I've heard as I've talked to people who are experts in the subject, specifically of political polarity, is that very often gerrymandering can aggravate this situation. And I wonder if you feel that generally the state of redistricting, again, nationwide, somehow influences this move to the extremes and somehow makes it so you don't have room for like a Charlie Baker in the Republican Party because the moderates just aren't present in government.
I think there's a common sense link there that I agree with. And let me try to do justice to both sides, because I also think that one shouldn't oversell gerrymandering as a reason for the terrible national polarization.
Sure.
It would still be there even without gerrymandering.
Yeah.
But let me take the side that you were talking about first, because I largely agree with it. And I see it in action in Maryland, in which a truly professionally done gerrymander, you can predict which party will win every single seat. And
Mm-hmm.
that is accomplished by having the party that is in control have somewhat smaller majorities than it may feel entirely comfortable with, but still enough majorities that it will be the majority party primary that decides. And then in order to make that happen, they push the minority party into highly concentrated super packed districts. Now, if you look at the states where Republicans have drawn the gerrymander, and there is an interaction here with the Voting Rights Act in that very often in southern states, Texas, North Carolina, Alabama, it's hard to tell the difference between packed minority districts, which are advertising their super compliance with the Voting Rights Act. Hey, look here, we've got a district that is absolutely certain to be carried by an African American. Well, it's awfully convenient for the Republicans who are gerrymandering those same states to have taken the most loyal Democratic voters and packed them into a very few districts. So you wind up in many of these states, the Democrats who do come from Texas are not the types of Democrats who could ever, with perhaps a few exceptions like Beto or O'Rourke, but most of them are not going to win a Texas statewide race because they're not really centrist Democrats. They are instead having to worry about primaries in districts that are super, super Democratic.
Yeah.
And likewise, in Maryland, we have one Republican district, which by Maryland standards is super, super Republican. And so it's the Republican primary that has dictated who has won that. And if you go down to the state house level, you see a lot of that too, where it's the parties are polarized because you either have a sure Democratic district, in which case you have to worry about being primaried from the left, or you have a sure Republican district, in which case the worry is to be primaried from the right. And so you have legislators who set out their somewhat performative public stances of being super liberals or super conservatives because their real worry is being primaried from a more extreme part of their own party.
Yeah.
That's the case for yes, it's a genuine part of the problem. I will point out that you look at the US Senate, which where obviously gerrymandering plays no role,
Hmm.
and you do see the same polarization, no gerrymandering, and yet Susan Collins hangs on as the only New England Republican who is left. The
Hmm.
Democrats who used to do very, very well in rural and Republican states used to be not thought of as strange at all that George McGovern came from South Dakota, which then was also a largely Republican state. But Democrats would do well because they figured out the formulas. And politics has become nationalized. That's part
Hmm.
of what's going on. So that rather than simply thinking, hey, we know George McGovern or Frank Church from Idaho or the many Democrats who used to do well, now they think national issues got to get our national party configuration, one more vote. And that one more vote is more important than, wait a minute, I know this person. He's actually not, kind of
Yeah.
reasonable.
That's what it's funny. That's what we talked about in the last episode is that if you try to run as a Democrat, for example, in a more solid Republican area, you end up running against Nancy Pelosi, and of
Yeah.
course Susan Collins was effectively running against Mitch McConnell's reputation up in Maine, and I was there during the election.
Oh,
I
yeah.
heard the ads, so
And I wrote a piece back in, I guess it was 2015, because I'm fascinated by Northeastern Republicans. I wrote a whole magazine piece about them, and
okay,
I said and I talked about Weld, and I talked about, I guess Baker was new then,
yeah,
but many of these people, and the um, the basic syndrome is that they can get themselves elected governor um, because a lot of people, a lot of registered Democrats will recognize, we need the broom to sweep clean. We need someone who hasn't bought into
mhm,
all the deals in Boston State House
yeah,
or the Annapolis State House.
mhm,
Sure, elect them as governor because they, Massachusetts politics is three people in a room, and at least this way, one of them won't be a Democrat,
yeah,
and the but then they have nowhere to go. They can't get into the U.S. Senate. And again, you saw this with Weld. I'm not
mhm,
going to speak anything about what would happen, but Larry Hogan, some of these ideas have to be going through his head, which is the very same people who are delighted to vote for him for governor. The whole race would be nationalized, and all of a sudden, it would be, what exactly do you think of Trump? Well, Larry's made pretty clear that he didn't vote for Trump,
yeah.
but that wouldn't be good enough. Just as with Susan Collins, there would be massive guns brought to bear to nationalize anything. So you have this dilemma. It's still possible to have the governorships, and again, you do see some of the mirror image of that in some Republican states. Although this is getting rarer and rarer, but at least until a few years ago, Democrats were pretty good at picking off governorships in places like Montana
Mhm.
um, because those races were not being nationalized. Again, the trend is very scary because the trend is toward nationalizing, things way down to, you know, city council.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, we could go on for hours about that. That's a huge and again to just bring the listeners into the conversation too. If you've listened to the past couple of episodes, gerrymandering is part of the problem, but like you said, there's the nationalization of elections. There's
I see, and I won't tell stories that get too local because I don't want them to come back and haunt me. But
yeah.
I have seen people saying no one should get a nomination for county council who isn't with, uh, on the right side of Trump versus anti-Trump. And I was, come on,
Oh,
and this affects party primaries too. And likewise, you see some of this in the Democratic Party with the squad, successfully primarying various old line Democrats. And
yeah.
I see that sifting down to the county and municipal level on the Democratic side too.
Yeah. Yeah. And so I have one more question for you, which is, at the end of every episode, I always like to give people some way they can take action. So if I'm listening to you talk and I want to tackle the issue of redistricting and I want to tackle the issue of gerrymandering in my state, are there things me as the lowly individual voter can do to positively affect the situation?
Yeah, assuming you're not a map nerd, in which case I would say go ahead and submit some sample maps. But
Okay.
that's a specialty taste, obviously.
Yeah.
For the rest of us, uh, if you're lucky enough to live in a state that lets regular citizens on into the process in some way, um, Michigan, Virginia are states that just came into that category. By all means, apply, because you might get picked. And in fact, one of the ways that I advise trying to be more active in general is that you will find that county and state government have all sorts of advisory commissions, not on this issue necessarily.
Yeah.
Um, it's an amazing way of getting some mileage, figuring out how these governments work. And
Hmm.
once you've been on one commission, they may invite you, hey, why not apply to more? They love having registered independents for a lot of these. Because of this party balance issue, they love to be able to
Hmm.
point to some diversification that way. So think about that. It can be hard, given that in the gerrymandered states, lawmakers clutch this to their bosom. It's like Gollum and the Precious. I mean, I'm sorry to be disrespectful, but
Yeah.
this is for many of them the ring of power of reelection, and they
Yeah.
relinquish it very easily. But um, if you educate yourself about where the most embarrassing parts of your state's gerrymander are,
Yeah.
and they may not be obvious, but things that were done to protect someone. Um, and you just write letters to the editor. For example, let me talk about a very successful format for a letter to the editor. In
Yeah.
Maryland, when we began digging into the maps, we began seeing the fingers, as I call them. And those are little peninsulas of land that were meant to include someone's residence who they wanted to vote to run in the district,
Mm.
or to exclude someone's residence because they were afraid of that they would win if they would run in their own
Sure.
home district. Um, so I have seen wonderful letters to the editor that simply and sweetly, without having to raise their voice to get into our theme, and without
Hmm.
having to accuse anyone of much of anything, say, have you noticed in the map of our own county that the district map extends, 5 miles unnecessarily out of the way here? Did you know that that was done because they had a grudge against that person and wanted to make sure that they wouldn't be in the legislature? Well, I can guarantee that even without an action point, the guilty parties in the gerrymander hate seeing letters like that. They hate
Mm.
seeing a spotlight on the details. Another of my favorite stories, which I haven't seen in a letter to the editor, but it would make a great one, is that if you look at a different part of the gerrymandered state house districts in Baltimore County, you see that they ran the lines around individual buildings in order to try to defeat the person who was an incumbent that they wanted to defeat. Uh,
Uh-huh.
and people hear those stories, and it gets them interested at a local level.
Hmm.
You might reach one or two people who then become the next letter writers, and that's how a lot of these issues are advanced, is by having uh, people who are dedicated to reminding the public. By the way, you haven't fixed this injustice yet. I wrote a letter a year ago, and here I am back writing about a different angle of the same problem because it hasn't been fixed yet.
Yep. So if I'm going to summarize that, I think number one, math nerds, we need you. Number one,
Yes.
first and foremost. Number two, for the rest of you, just be a pain in the ass, like any way
And
you can.
a well-informed one, because no one
Well,
needs
yes,
to
yes,
hear
thank you.
the poorly informed person raising their voice. But
Yes.
people when people see details, when people see street names or town
Yeah.
names in the letter to the editor, oh, their eye is drawn to it, especially if it's their town.
Yes. So again, to maybe couch that for folks, think of like the A student going and contesting their A minus grade to the teacher. That's the tone we want. Does that sound
Yes.
about right?
Yes. Respectful and having the details all in a row.
All right. Perfect. Perfect. I think we'll cap it off there. Walter, thank you very much for joining me.
Thank
This
you.
has been really, really fascinating.
It's fun.
Thank you.
Thanks, Dan.